Hello, everyone. Welcome to KEI. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here at the Korea Economic Institute of America. Today's program is part of our academic paper series. It's actually one of our last few remaining programs that we have this year, which means that we're getting ready to gear up for our 2019 series. So we'll be sending out a call for papers in the next few weeks, so please keep an eye out for that. If you're interested in writing for us or know of anyone who is interested in writing for us, it'll be up on our website, and we'll be sending out an email to our general mailing list. So if you aren't signed up already, it's an additional reason to actually sign up and be on our KEI mailing list to hear about an opportunity for further your own research and to hear about great programs like the one that we have for you here today. Our speakers are actually old hands at this series. They were here back in 2015, just before I joined at KEI, and they were talking about defectors in North Korea and defector North Korea press conferences and how that was used as a tool by the North Korean regime. But they're here today to talk about defectors in South Korea, which has a personal resonance for me, because when I was in Korea as a Fulbright English teaching assistant in 2011-2012, I also spent a good chunk of time volunteering at a local center in Gwangju dedicated to helping North Korean defectors integrate into South Korean life, and I was helping them teach English, and teaching English, helping them learn English. And we often hear about North Korean defectors integrating into South Korean life. We hear about the troubles and the challenges that they face in integration and the hard life that they have in terms of integrating to a completely new world. But we hear less about their sense of belonging and their identity, which our presenters, Christopher and Stephen, are here today to present on with some great new survey data. So I'll briefly introduce them before we get into the program. You have their bios here in front of you, but to my left is Stephen Denney. He's a PhD candidate, Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. His primary research interests are Korean politics and society and the political economy of Northeast Asia. He's also a senior editor at Sino-NK. And to his left is Christopher Green. Chris is a PhD candidate in area studies at Korea at Leiden University. His research interests are on political sociology of North Korea. He's also a senior editor at Sino-NK, and he's a senior advisor for the International Crisis Group. So now I'll turn things over to Chris and Stephen to get us started with today's program.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody. There we go. Thanks to everybody. Sorry if you're looking that direction. You won't see much change. Try to check out one of the other screens. Thanks to everybody for coming to this event. We are taking over your lunchtime, and we recognize that. Thanks also to KEI for giving us this opportunity to discuss this new research. We're going to talk for between 20 minutes and half an hour before we move to some questions. If I can briefly explain a roadmap here, we're going to talk about the nature of the defector community, defector migrant community in South Korea, and the way variation exists within that community, countering what I think is an established narrative of a monolithic community of people with largely similar views, which we will hopefully establish for you is not the case. This research comes out of a survey and interview project that Stephen and I conducted in South Korea in the middle of 2016. We're going to talk more about the nature of the sample that we were able to generate later on in this conversation. I'll leave that to Stephen to discuss. But before we get to that bit, I'd like to discuss with you the motivation and the research questions that we went into the research with. We are often told that the resettlement of North Korean defector migrants in a relatively small numbers into South Korean society, starting in the late 1990s, continuing into the present day, constitutes, quote-unquote, unification in action. The idea that in the future, if South Korea and North Korea are to unify, many of the problems that occur in the microcosm of resettling the defector migrant community today will be much larger, but in many senses similar, in a future unification scenario. Now, we're not saying that unification will certainly happen, only that if it does take place, these issues, questions of resettlement, will occur in much larger scope at that time. So our assumption is that this unification in action that we are seeing today holds some insights into the challenges of integrating the two Koreas tomorrow. Okay, so based upon that hypothesis, we have 4 research questions which we're going to explore during this conversation and which are explored in the working paper in more detail. The first of these, as you can see on the screen, what do North Korean migrants themselves think about their national identities as newly resettled members of South Korean society? More often than not, discussion of the resettlement process focuses on very practical socioeconomic difficulties, provision of welfare, healthcare for the unique needs of the defector migrant community, and so on and so forth. But we argue that there is also an identitarian aspect to this that needs to be taken into account and isn't ordinarily taken into account. The second question, how do the attitudes of North Korean migrants compare with those of native-born South Koreans? Are they similar or different? And if they are different, to what degree are they different, and in which directions are they different? Do demographics or pre- and post-migration effects matter? That question will be explored in much more detail by Stephen later on, so I won't dwell on it. And then at the end, what are the implications? Stephen and I will offer some tentative suggestions for the implications of the findings from this research towards the end, but we recognize that the findings can be interpreted in an awful lot of different ways, and we don't want to have a monopoly on opinion on that. So we hopefully can bring that to the discussion once we've finished the presentation. Okay, now then, as I said, there is this conventional wisdom that the community of defector migrants in South Korea, which numbers 31,500 at time of writing, is somehow monolithic. That opinion, quite irrespective of variables that we would ordinarily consider having an impact on people's attitudes and values, do somehow not have an impact on the attitudes and values of defector migrants, that experiences in North Korea, experiences in China, experiences in South Korea, gender or number of things are somehow irrelevant, and the sample, the defector migrant community, is somehow monolithic and anti-Kim, and also, as a consequence of self-selection in the defection process, also a biased sample in some ways. We argue that's not the case. This typology of defector migrants comes from a 2008 paper that remains valuable to this day, written by Chung Byung-ho at one of the universities in Seoul. He argues that there are 6 major cohorts of defector migrants in South Korea today. There are people who selected a system, North Korea's communist system, nascent communist system, or South Korea's nascent capitalist system, in the period between liberation in 1945 and the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, and made their decision to cross the, by then, at that time, very porous DMZ to live in the system that they believed would best suit them. The second cohort is war refugees from the Korean War from 1950 to 53, a very, very large group of people. Population movements at that time obviously were far larger than any that we have seen since. The third category is Cold War, quote-unquote, heroes who returned to the state between 1962 and 1993, a reasonably small number of people given the number of years involved. And then the post-Cold War, quote-unquote, returning brethren of 1993 to 97, escaping residents of 97 to 2004, and the new settlers, or settlement, of the mid-2000s to the present day. And we don't have any comment to make on the use of that particular phrase in describing the defector migrant community, only to know that it is a phrase, settlement, that is or has been quite commonly used at times in the past. Okay. Within these 6 major cohorts, there are 3 which are of decreasing salience to the nature of identity in the defector migrant community, for the simple fact that time has passed and an awful lot of people in these cohorts have now passed away. In the sample that we use for this research, we have one person who would fit into that middle category of Cold War heroes who returned to the state. We have several more, and Stephen probably has the numbers right to hand from the preceding 2 cohorts, but the ones which are of greatest relevance to any research done today are, of course, the final 3, those many thousands who defected from North Korea to South Korea between 1993 and the present day. As you can see on the graph on the screen now, the total number of people coming from North Korea and entering South Korea, of course, as everybody will probably be quite well aware, peaked in the period 2009 to 2011, for reasons that we can explore later if you wish. But in addition to simply variation in the sample stemming from the year of people's departure from North Korea, we argue that there are lots of other variables that can have salient effects on people's identity and values and attitudes, including but not limited to the list on the screen, which I see is fairly small, so some of you may not be able to see it, so let me run through it very quickly for you. The top bar says age, the second one gender, the third education, subdivided into education experiences in North and South Korea. The fourth one, it says time, which means time spent in China and in South Korea, and of course in North Korea prior to departing or arriving in South Korea. And then the final one is location. If you spend any time talking to defector migrants from North Korea, they argue that you can divide the state of North Korea today into 3 specific geographical categories. The borderland, which is a rather flexible category, but basically means the area within about 20 to 25 kilometers of the border, or Pyongyang City, metropolitan area, sometimes taken to include the conjoined city of Pyeongseong, or the interior of the country. People in the borderland often will tell you that people who live in the interior of the country are significantly less knowledgeable about the outside world than they themselves are, or people in Pyongyang. So, with such variation in the community, there are many methods that one can use to capture this variation. There are 3 categories again on the slide. One is talks of large N surveys of many thousands of arriving defector migrants, one carried out by the National Intelligence Service, of course, of South Korea, others carried out by the Korea Institute for National Unification, a state-run research organization, and the third conducted by the Hana Foundation, which is the organization largely organized underneath the Ministry of Unification, which organizes annual surveys of between 2,000 and 3,000 arriving defector migrants as well, focusing on their lives in South Korea rather than things they may have done before arriving. Those surveys are not always, with the honorable exception of the Hana Foundation, that survey data is not generally available to the ordinary researcher. Whereas in the second category, smaller N surveys and other projects of that nature, that the material does tend to be available to the non-official in the outside world. Some famous examples of such survey projects include Steph Haggard and Marcus Nolan's famous work that took in the opinion of 1,646 defector migrants across 2 separate surveys earlier in this century. Yang Moon-soo and Kim Byung-yeon, sorry. Their survey related to marketization of North Korea, which involved 876 participants, and then Kang and a number of other researchers did a project involving 848 people, of whom half were from the DPRK much more recently. This is not an exhaustive list of such projects, but we just want to give you a sample of the kinds of work that has been done in this area in the past and which you may have run across. Then there is a third category of what we call particularities research, which is very small samples, down to and including samples of one sort of ethnographic and such research. And our research project, then, where does it fit in? Well, it fits in the middle. It's one of the middle category of research projects. We have a sample of, as Stephen will go into in more detail momentarily, a sample of 352 people, which we will be expanding, by the by, later this year, repeating the survey with some additional funding from a Korean body. So we would hope to get up into the numbers that you can see there of the smaller end projects after we've done this a few more times. Okay, so in that context then, having put our work into context, I'm going to hand over to Stephen for discussion of what we actually did and what we found, which is, of course, the part that everybody wants to hear about. Stephen.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Thanks to Kyle and the KEI staff for putting this event together. Nice to see some familiar faces, and I look forward to meeting new people. I'm sure Chris feels exactly the same way. So, what did we do exactly? So Chris has done a good job of contextualizing the research that is conducted on the defector migrant community. So let me tell you a bit about what we did exactly and how it's new and why we think it's exciting and worth listening to and worth further research. Whether or not I convince you is an open question, isn't it? So, 2016, as Chris mentioned, we surveyed 352 resettled defector migrants in South Korea in various locations in Seoul and just outside of it. So you can think of this sample as being comprised of mainly the Seoul Gyeonggi area, which would constitute most of the resettled defector migrants anyway, but that is definitely something to note. That's not up there on the slide. As Chris mentioned, it was 352 was the original sample size. For the purposes of analysis in this paper and some of the other work that we have out there that you may come across, we're working with a number of 334. The reason for that is we've excluded those who spent less than 12 years or who left North Korea before they turned 12. Research in psychology would indicate that if you leave a country before then, the impression of being in that country is lost on you, in short. It's much more complicated than that, but that's effectively the explanation for why we're only working with a number of 334 here. There are many in the defector community who did leave North Korea before they were 12, and I would argue that they're very different from those who did not, among other things. Chris also mentioned that in addition to implementing the survey, some of which I will go over with you in some detail, we followed up with about 100 of the survey takers to do pretty in-depth interviews. We're not going to be talking a whole lot about that today, unfortunately, just because we had to choose to focus on something, and we're choosing on the surveys because I like surveys, and it's a lot neater and tighter and easier to present than interview material, which is sometimes unstructured and anxiety-inducing. This survey that we've done is not entirely new. It is a national identity survey that we have adapted for migrant group, but the survey questions themselves come from a Korean identity survey that's been run now for 3 waves in 2005, 10, and 15 by the East Asia Institute in cooperation with the Junganyobo and the Asiatic Research Institute at Korea University to operationalize, measure that is, the national identity of individuals living in South Korea. That is, what are the conditions for national membership and belonging? Not citizenship per se, it does include that, but it's a much more expansive definition. And we've taken the survey and adopted it along the lines not dissimilar from the new immigrant survey that's run by the World Values Survey in Canada to capture the political attitudes and national identity of newcomers, as we say in Canada, to the country. There are 2 advantages of this, among many other, I'm sure. The first is that it gives us the ability to compare native responses to the newcomers, in case you want to know how defector migrants are different and or similar to native South Koreans. Further, it just makes the design of the survey so much easier because someone's already done most of the work. That is very small. I'm sure you cannot read that. I was really apprehensive to add this table with so much information on it, and it is not appearing very well because you're so far from it. So I'm going to just run down this So if you just listen to the sound of my voice, I will tell you a bit about the characteristics of our survey.
It's also in the paper,
It's also in the paper,
which they all should have.
which you all should have. So I don't know what page that's on, but you can find it. And whatever page that is, I encourage you to turn to it as I run through this, so you can work with me. I didn't bring it with me anyway. I'm sure you can find it. Page 8. Page 8. So again, the number of respondents that we're working with here is 334. So we subtracted 18 of those who left North Korea at too young of an age to be considered from North Korea, in short. The median age of our sample is 46. The number of female respondents is 240, or 73% of the population. That's pretty consistent with the percentage of females who are in the defector migrant population in South Korea. After this, I'm breaking this down into pre and post migration variables. So things that have occurred before the individuals left and things that have occurred afterwards, or after they left North Korea. So the average number of years that the sample spent in the DPRK is 35. The average time of defection is about 2005, which is notable, near the peak of the defection of time for defection of this group. About 65% of them completed high school or above in North Korea, indicating relatively well-educated population, which is also consistent with the realities insofar as we know them from census data that's provided by North Korea. 77% of them were born in a borderland province, which we define here. You can see it's noted there in the paper, but basically the Sino-NK border, having been born in or lived for a significant amount of time in one of those provinces. We have perceived living standards in North Korea, which you can read as class. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but let's use that as shorthand, of which about 18% are we would classify as upper or upper middle in terms of the material well-being. I refer you to the appendix if you want to see exactly how we measured that. Coming in the middle class is about 25% of the population, and lower middle is about 53%. From the information that we have on the objective well-being and material well-being of this group of people in North Korea, our sample might be skewed a little bit towards those who are not so well-to-do. So that's something to note. Of the post-migration variables here, the average number of years that, average not the median, average number of years that the group spent in China was 4 years. The average number of years they spent in South Korea has been 8. And the average year of arrival was about 2008. So you can see there that there is a significant time wherein they spent in an in-between country, which is, of course, also not unusual, in fact, quite common. 19% of our population returned to South Korea and went back to school and graduated at least high school. 12% of them are currently students, and 36% of our population is currently fully employed, which is quite low. So what are we going to do with all this information? Well, we're going to look at 3 variables that we've created using questions from the National Identity Survey. I'm not going to go through all of the questions there with you, but we want to operationalize national identity in 3 ways. We want to look at the salience or the importance of ethnocultural traits. I'll expand on that in a moment here because that might not be readily apparent why that's important. The second, we want to look at how close one feels to the Republic of Korea. It's a closeness measure, pretty standard. And also the level of pride that one has in South Korea that can be read as patriotism. So ethnocultural traits, which is a measure, it's a binary measure in the way it's used in the research here, that's taken from asking respondents how important ancestry and tradition are to being truly South Korean. What I've done is we've taken the responses as a composite index and I divided it by the median score to get a new binary. So that would be, if it's greater than median score, 1, else 0. The ethnocultural traits, we argue, is interesting in the Korean case and elsewhere as well, because especially with regards to questions of national reunification, the bedrock of the claim that unification ought to occur or is natural is the idea of a nation divided, and Ernst Gellner's sort of articulation of the concept. And one common way to measure this sentiment or this idea is to look at how central ancestry and tradition are, especially in the Korean case. So when Koreans say, like, we are one. That is an articulation of an ethnocultural claim to national membership and definition of what Korea is, that combines North and South Koreans based on the idea that they share both an ancestry and a rich cultural tradition. So why is it important to ask people whether that is important? Why is it important and interesting to look at what people think about that? Well, if they don't think it's particularly important, it's an indication that there is a division between, or there is a lack of buy-in to this idea that North and South Korea are indeed one, and perhaps should be. It's a proxy measure, it's not perfect, but it's reasonable, and I think it's interesting. And also, it's something that gets looked at a lot in some of my other work as well, about the decline in the importance of ancestry and tradition, with the decline of ethnic nationalism in South Korea, a central concern of other research. The closeness to South Korea, I think, is just, do they feel like they belong? And then the pride, again, is a measure of patriotism. So what are we going to do with these measures? We're going to do two things. We're going to look at, we're going to compare weighted mean scores. Let me go to the next slide here. Between a South Korean sample in 2015, from the East Asian Institute. It's the latest national identity survey that's been run in South Korea. I'm going to compare the weighted mean scores on these three variables that we've created, which we're able to replicate using the South Korean data because we replicated the survey with slight additions for pre and post migration effects, to see whether or not there is a convergence or divergence. We don't have any hypotheses per se. You could certainly come up with some. We could workshop some here now. I'm not going to do that. We're just going to look at the empirical outcomes to determine whether there is convergence or divergence, because I'm not sure we are clear on our empirical expectations of such things. So the first one here is on cultural traits. Okay, let me tell you, there are no differences. There is national identity convergence. Insofar as our sample, it can be read as representative of the defector migrant population in South Korea. I will add that this is not strictly speaking a probability sample, so inference, that is the external validity of our sample, is something which you could certainly question. And if you're a methodological purist, you wouldn't buy anything that I'm about to tell you.
And you wouldn't study North and South Korea either.
It'd be very difficult. We think that we have found a way to do a probability sample later this year, so we're very excited about that. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not we're able to replicate our results. I think we will, honestly. In any case, there is some probability to the selection of our samples, but it is not entirely so. And I'll leave it at that. We can talk about that more later if you want. In any case, there are no differences. So let me just kind of show you some visuals and get on to the more interesting thing. With regards to the importance of ethnocultural traits, there is an average score on a scale of 2 to 8 of about 6.5 for both populations. For the closeness to South Korea, most people feel close. North Koreans feel slightly less close, and if you submit this to a t-test for statistical difference, it is statistically significant. Statistically speaking, substantively, it is not, because it's well above 80% for both the native South Korean population and the North Korean sample. And pride in North Korea, there's also a slight decrease for the North Koreans on a scale of 7 to 28. The average weighted scores here come in just above, a tick above 18. And again, I'm saying weighted, so I should explain what I mean by that, because I didn't. We took the Hana Foundation's surveys, which give you a full picture of the demographics, close to a census of the defector migrant population, and we weighted the scores to adjust for over or under sampling. We did a pretty good job. The only thing that really comes in under is material well-being, and we corrected for that, and honestly, it doesn't matter. The scores don't change very much, which suggests that weight shouldn't be used, because otherwise they're manipulating the outcome. We did the same for South Korean using Statistics Korea census data, which is what you would use. Okay, but let's get on to something. So if I ended here, that could be interesting. That could be a null finding, if you will, if we were to attach hypotheses to it and we don't find any differences. Null findings are sometimes interesting. In this case, they are, that there is national identity convergence. What does that mean? Chris and I are going to talk about it at the end, and then we would like your insight and questions on that as well. The second thing that we did, though, is we wanted to look at whether or not there are any within-group differences, because it stands to reason, as Chris has primed you to think, that not all North Korean defector migrants think similarly, because people are different. And surprise. So what we've done here, I'm not going to go over all this, I've already sort of introduced it to you. Those three dependent variables we looked at are those three variables. The measures of national identity are the dependent variables. And the predictors, or the independent variables rather, are age cohorts, which we didn't talk, so we divided into 3 age cohorts, 19 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 plus, somewhat arbitrarily, but that's kind of pretty standard industry practice. We have a variable for gender, female 1, else 0, that would be male. And then we took those pre- and post-migration factors for which we have good data. Some of the data I will add was cut because of quality concerns, so it's not as complete as we had hoped it to be, but it is otherwise quite complete, we think. So we've taken these demographic variables, age and gender, plus pre- and post-migration effects, and I've pumped these into regression. So I don't know how many of you like to do regressions, know regressions, care about regressions, but what it allows you to do is to take into account the simultaneous effect of all of these different factors to see what you get, to determine whether or not we can determine or find, pinpoint, locate any within-group differences. And that's not great either. It's quite far, can't see it. What I want to point out is I refer you to the regression output model, or the regression output in the paper if you want to look at this closer. But let me cut to the chase. Of all of those factors identified, the one which matters most and on all 3 of our variables is age cohort, specifically the 55 plus age cohort. So there is, in the words of people who just kind of research, a cohort effect. That is, being 55 plus matters. Using the 19 to 34 as a reference category by which the next 2 groups are compared, what you see is that those who are aged 55 plus think differently, and that difference is statistically significant and substantive. I will refer you to the log odds for how different they are in the paper, where you can see that it is both statistically significant and meaningful, that is substantive. So this is what I'm going to focus on. There are some other nuggets of insight which we're happy to discuss further at the end here during the question and answer. Maybe we might refer back to it if it's appropriate, but I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going through this because I really want to dig down a little bit at these cohort effects, because that's what we see as being the most significant, and we think that's interesting. So let me just expound on this a little bit. I don't know how well you can see that. Probably not great. So on the ethnocultural traits, if you looked at what I've created here are predicted probabilities for the 2 binary variables, that is the ethnocultural traits and how close you feel. Either you think ethnocultural traits are important or you don't, or you feel close to the ROK or you don't. And on the ethnocultural traits, those 55 plus, taking into account all of our statistical controls or all the other variables, just under a tick under 80% of those 55 plus are likely to think that ethnocultural traits are important. Compare that to those who are 19 to 34, which come in at under 60. So the ethnocultural traits are more important for older folks. For the feeling close to the ROK, this one, it is statistically significant. Is it substantively different? I'm not so sure, because you have close to, for 19 to 34, 35 to 54, just under 90% are likely to feel close to the ROK. Those 55 plus are more likely to feel close to the ROK. It's getting pretty close to about 98%. Basically everyone who's 55 plus feels close to the ROK. Do you believe that? I think there's a case to be made. I will like to point out that this question is actually not that great, because there's probably a serious amount of social desirability bias in the answers to the respondents. Those who are answering the question were, there were organizations who distributed this survey, but the question is quite simple, stated and blunt. And from our understanding, I think this would be corroborated by others, defector migrants don't want to come across as being ungrateful. and they're less likely to say that they feel distant from the ROK, is a case that could be made. I'm not making that strong here. I have not proven that social desirability bias is within the data, saying it might be, which might explain why these are so high. Even so, the 55 plus scores significantly higher from a baseline that is already pretty high. So what does that mean? Well, everyone feels pretty close, but the older folks within the group feel even closer. Lastly, and this one is where you see the biggest difference, in terms of patriotism, pride in the achievements of the ROK, which is measured by looking at a battery of questions about developments in South Korean state and society, from sports and diplomacy to political achievements in the international arena, economic achievements, and several other things which I'm happy to go into, or just simply refer you to the paper, to the appendix where I outline it in some detail. The predicted value, or the patriotism score, is significantly higher for the 55 plus, just at about 21.8. Whereas if you compare that to, say, the 35 to 54-year-olds, it's under 19. That's a significant difference. And I work with this kind of data a lot and across many nations, and a difference of this size is notable, which suggests that this older group feels a greater sense of pride in what the ROK has done, or they're greater patriots, if you want. That language tends to be a little cheesy, I know, so we're aware of that sort of terminology, but we do think, and in established research on subjects using this kind of survey data, it is found to be a meaningful measure of how proud one feels in the country in which they live. So that's the data. There are some other nuggets of insight, as I said, but let me recap everything that I just went through. So first, and notably, there is variation in the defector migrant population. I think there's a tendency among some, as Chris pointed out, to think of this population as homogeneous. They are not. Second is there is national identity convergence between North Koreans and South Koreans, which, if you wanted to ask, is unification in process working on the national identity front? The answer that we would forward would be yes. There are, however, significant within-group differences for defector migrants, especially and notably across age cohorts. I want to pause here, and I'm going to invite Chris to jump in here for a bit, because this is something that him and I are going back and forth on in terms of how to interpret this. So I work with cohort analysis in other contexts across different populations, including Korea. And it is a tricky thing to interpret. What does age mean? Well, we've grouped age here by cohorts because we think there is something unique about belonging to this age cohort different from another one because of the experiences they have. In this case, it would be the experiences they had in North Korea, but also in South Korea, which makes it really interesting and fun to think about and to interpret, but also very difficult.
And if we take the most obvious and impressive finding from this research, which is that people aged 55 plus are more likely to think that ethnocultural variables are important, they're more likely to feel close to the Republic of Korea, and they're more likely to have pride in the Republic of Korea. Why would they have that view of the ethnocultural nature of Korea? Well, we can argue that perhaps it is because, as Stephen has argued to me, the people of that age will have grown up under Kim Il-sung's regime in North Korea. This may have a certain impact on their view of what it is to be Korean. Certainly North Korea was the past is always a different country, but North Korea is a very different country in that period. You could also argue, as I am inclined to do, that socioeconomic factors in South Korea are important. People who are older tend to encounter South Korea in a very different way to people who are younger. I mean, that's quite obvious in a sense. But we have visited the homes of, well, at least 20 different homes of people in this age bracket, this age cohort. There is a tendency for them to be quite content with the way they are treated in South Korea, to feel that they are living under some system which is in fact more socialist than the system they left behind. I mean, they are joking when they say that, but you can see a kernel of truth in it. The idea of receiving sufficient assistance from the government to live relatively comfortably. The tendency not to have to get a job, not to have to engage with some of the harsher aspects of South Korea's already quite harsh neoliberal capitalist environment, which is something that younger people have to do. And then younger people, on the flip side, may go to school in South Korea, which aids and abets them in becoming, quote unquote, closer to South Korea and their values and attitudes. And then there is a group in the middle, which arrives from North Korea, is required to carve out a niche for themselves in South Korea. That's a pretty difficult process. And the result is certain differences in identity, for example. So that's a very interesting area. You may have different interpretations, and if you do, please, we do urgently want to hear them, but that's just some possible interpretations of why you would end up with a result like this.
I want to add that being familiar with similar survey designs, research designs in newcomer and immigrant-rich countries, Canada specifically, there are notable identity divergences on similar items. In all of this, that item included, you may be asking, does it actually matter? Good question, always a good question for academics. I would argue yes. I know we haven't done it with this data specifically. We hope to do that going forward, but look how it is associated with, or can be used, yes, how it is associated with other relevant variables, policy relevant, say unification, attitudes towards immigrants, which is becoming an increasingly salient question in South Korea, and many others. And I found in my own work, looking deeper at the South Korean data and incomparable comparative data, that your national identity is often associated with or can be used to predict your attitude towards a number of other salient questions about the nature of modern societies today. So that's my claim to relevance of the research that we're presenting here. And we hope to continue to go further. We have a few things in the works. We're limited in what we're going to provide in a working paper, but we're happy to go into greater detail in the question and answer. And I think that would take us to our last little point here. Findings highlight need for sustained research effort. In other words, keep funding us, please.
Thank you both for an excellent recap of a great paper and your comments at the end, which I think sort of shed more light onto some of your thoughts about what was some of the underlying arguments that you have in the paper. And I know you talk a lot about the limitations of the research that you found, and you do a really good job of outlining a lot of the other papers that have done these smaller end sample sizes and sort of the constraints that you face in terms of not having access to the larger end sample size data pools that the KINU or the Ministry of Unification would have. But if I'm going to enter some hypotheticals here, if you've done further research and all of the research that you've presented in this paper sort of holds up, the key findings of the older generations are more likely or more in favor of a unification or have a more stronger sense of identity with South Korea. What sort of are the key takeaways? What does the government do with this? How does this translate into changes in policy or the acceptance of the current policy as it is?
The tendency seems to be to critically argue that the South Korean government is doing a bad job of resettling North Korean defector migrants. In some ways, that is undoubtedly true. We're not here to shill for the South Korean government. But we have found in this research that there are cohorts who are resettling quite well. Now, maybe that is not a function of government policy. Maybe it's just a function of the social environment into which they land when they arrive in South Korea. But at the very least, let us recognize that there are areas of success and areas of failure in South Korean government policy. And in the resettling of older cohorts, looks like an area of success, which is, first off, okay, that's a good thing in and of itself, but equally it allows the government, the Ministry of Unification, the relevant providers of certain services to different groups of defector migrants to focus their attention on the areas where they are perhaps failing. And we would like to encourage that.
I think it's, again, helpful to think about this in terms of cohorts. not just because we presented that, because I think this is consistent with what we've seen on the ground in our sort of we're not ethnographers, but we do ethnography by accident all the time. Our in-depth interviews and the survey data itself. In fact, is this still working? Did they turn it off? Maybe they did. It's okay. Don't actually need it. It's not a big deal. You may recall from the predicted values for the pride variable that it goes from 19 to 34 to 35, from 19 to 34 to 35 to 54. There's a decrease and then there's a sharp uptick. Without reading too much into things based upon that variable itself, what you see, or what we see, and I think Chris and I are in agreement on this, is that if you resettle young enough to effectively become South Korean through and through, that is, you go back to university, notably, you build new social networks, the experiences associated with that sort of mitigate the difficulties of being a migrant, of which this group most certainly is. Also, if you're old enough to resettle in South Korea in such a way that you're able to avoid the difficulties of competing in a pretty rigorous job market in South Korea, highly competitive one, your experiences in that resettlement are going to be more positive. When we went for group interviews and individual interviews with folks who were older, we were usually able to do about 8 at a time. The reason we could do that is because they all live in the same apartment complex, usually on the same floor, and often they all congregate together. That is not the case for younger defector migrants. But those younger defector migrants who we cited in 19 to 34 are able to rebuild their social capital by starting over, going back to school, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this critical in-between group who are too old to really go back to school. They're not old enough to either take old age pension or to subsist on the support of a community and or siblings who are perhaps working, which is often the case, who are subjected to the difficulties of the job market in South Korea without the skills necessary to compete. And if I were advising an ROK official who was reviewing defector migrant settlement, I would point to that and say therein lies some difficulties in resettlement. Full stop. I don't know if Chris wants to add anything to that.
Well, it does suggest that the policies currently in place to, for example, subsidize the incomes of defector migrants in that middle category may not be sufficient, may not be working, may require a rethink. I mean, the government also faces the option of either improving training opportunities for people in that middle segment or discouraging their escape from North Korea in the first place. But by what means you would do that, I don't know. But it seems that policies to provide educational opportunities to young defector migrants may have been premised on socioeconomic rationales, but they also have an identitarian outcome, which is worth bearing in mind. If you want to integrate and acculturate an incoming group of migrants to South Korean society, education is an excellent way to do it. Now, that might sound commonsensical now we've run through all this research, but it's something that's worth bearing in mind.
One last question before we turn things over to the audience. What exactly is sort of the relationship between, or how important is the relationship between national identity and unification? I know it's kind of hard to make that claim in a singular sense, but I was wondering if there's been any further research, as if you guys don't have enough research to go off from this paper, but is there anything from the most famous cases, the East and West Germany unification, and how important was national identity pre and post? I mean, I think if something were to happen pretty quickly in the Korean Peninsula in terms of unification, a lot of these identity issues may change really rapidly. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship again between national identity and unification and actual unification of the two countries.
let me amend the actual unification, just let's say first support for unification, because that's what I was preparing to answer in my mind.
Okay.
So if you look at, so we didn't include a question on whether or not they support unification. I don't know why we didn't do that, because there's cuts you make to a survey because it needs to be done within a reasonable time limit, otherwise people give you bad answers.
Our expectation would also be that you get 100% yes vote.
There is that as well, right. So maybe it's better, and this is what I'm going to say anyway. If you look at the South Korean data, some of which was presented here, at the relationship between the type of national identity one has, so whether or not these ethnocultural items are more salient, that is, whether they're buying into an ethnic national view of the nation, those who score higher are more likely to support unification. Those who do not are much less likely to support unification, which supports this, I think, thing that's been assumed for so long, which is the bedrock upon which national unification sort of as a natural outcome is predicated, is this ethnocultural vision for the Korean Peninsula. There's support for that data in public opinion. In terms of actual, like once it ends, I guess in theory you would think that if Koreans buy into this idea that they are truly indeed R1, they're more likely to support policies meant for integration and redistribution, which are almost certainly forthcoming. I'm sure there has been research done on that in Germany. Haven't done it, but I'm sure it exists, and I'm going to look at that because I never really thought about it like that. I mean, I have thought about it like that, but I haven't done anything about it. Now that you've asked me, I'm going to do it. It's a tough question.
All right, now we'll turn things over to you all. If you could please state your name and your affiliation before asking a question. We'll go here and then second.
Oh, Steve Winters, independent consultant. Just a quick comment, but when you're drawing conclusions from this, it seems to me it could be objected that the defector community or refugee community is not at all necessarily representative of the majority of people in the North. So that drawing conclusions about what's going to happen to the majority of people in the North could be questioned on that basis. But I'd just like to ask, we had a talk here recently with the gentleman who prepares this OECD report on Korea, I think also Japan, and among many things that he had to offer was their current report showing that like 40% of the elderly people in South Korea are in pretty bad shape. And how does that compare to the same age group of defectors and so forth and so on? Or, I mean, they are in better shape because they get more support from the government?
To the first one about, that is absolutely correct. And we're not using this data to infer about what North Koreans think. A hypothetical situation wherein there might be unification and those in the North would then be new settlers, that's kind of what we're looking at here, or just the group that has resettled.
One might wish to imagine what some of this might mean. I mean, some of the most interesting data here from my perspective concerns things like class status in North Korea and the impact of class status in North Korea on resettlement experience in South Korea. Because if you remember the 6 major cohorts of defectors, some of the newest groups, a larger percentage of those people come from relatively better socioeconomic backgrounds. As we can imagine, the mid to late 90s period, there was a lot of existential economic distress among those leaving North Korea. In the 2000s, especially post-2005, things have gotten a lot better. And that does have an impact. So we can think through the changing class structure of North Korea, the improving economic situation there for some people, but not all, and think about possible impacts. Because at least the South Korean government's position tends to be that if the current South Korean government's position is a very contested area, if we South Korea help to improve the socioeconomic conditions in North Korea, that will have certain positive impacts on a future unification scenario across a range of different, and not just identity, of course. Health is one off-stated area of interest. Do you have anything more to add on that?
So the HANA Foundation report is the authoritative source on the objective well-being of resettled defector migrants. And of course, there's plenty of quality data from the OECD and other sources, statistics, Korea, et cetera, on the objective material well-being of elderly South Koreans. We haven't looked at that data side by side specifically. I know we have looked at it. There is definitely an impression among some in South Korea that this group is favored over native-born South Koreans, and it is a source of some tension. A lot, and is it politically salient? Not sure.
We haven't looked, as Stephen said, we haven't looked at this directly, and it's definitely an area in which we have interest. But these things are relative too, and in our experience of interviews with older people, of which there were many, we did find very few complaints about the conditions under which they live. And I think partly that may be relative to the conditions from which they came, whereas the sense of expectation among South Korean native-born population may be different, but also there may be some small differences in what the resettled elderly North Korean population receives, which does improve their life. Now, these people, they don't live gloriously luxurious lives. They're just content with a relatively low but stable sense of well-being. So that's really what we're talking about here. Nothing particularly splendid.
Thank you. Michael Tre Kim. I'm a diplomat, but I'm here on personal capacity, tap puncher. So, but nevertheless, thank you, Stephen, about mentioning what I'll call the in-betweeners, neither the older nor the younger. I would think they would be competing with people from developing countries who likewise don't have a lot of skills that they bring with them, like from Nepal or Uzbekistan, even I would guess from the Yangon area, the autonomous region. So did you two notice anything unique about that particular cohort that sets them apart from all those other migrant workers, apart even from the ethnic Korean migrant workers that come from Yangon even? That's it.
When we first spoke with Kyle about doing this project, he asked us about comparisons with other nation migrants, the possibility of doing that research. We had to concede that that was not something we'd looked at with this particular research project. But there's no question that it's a very important area of study, and I hope either us or somebody else is going to do it soon.
Can I just tell a quick anecdote which just really stuck in my mind? We arranged for, we had research space at Yonsei University, and we arranged for a number of interviews to take place in our research office there. And one individual was 37 years old and was a hairdresser, would be an in-betweener. And she talked about what I'm going to call developing a real sense of grit to get by in South Korea. She said it with plenty of swagger as well, which I found extremely admirable, but it also stuck with me. And she talked about, she was younger, but still had a strong North Korean accent. Among many of the youths who we interacted with, they've all but lost that. And it's just clear that she belonged in a category that is distinct among this population. And I would imagine, we haven't really looked at that specifically, that they are competing with other co-ethnics, namely Chosunjok, who constitute the largest immigrant population in South Korea because they share an ethnicity. Of course, one has citizenship and the other one doesn't unless they naturalize through processes permitted by law. That wasn't a great anecdote. I didn't really get a lot in there, but it really stuck with me. And it just, we talked a lot about this in-betweener category, and it really was, it stood out. More research is needed.
Well, also there was a question, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There was a question in the survey about feelings towards multiculturalism, which was then replicated in a slightly different form in the interviews. And there is nothing a North Korean defector migrant likes less than being lumped into a category of multicultural. So there's no conversation, even though in reality it may be that the competition for jobs is indeed with the groups that you highlight, that is not the way the conversation is had. The conversation is had in comparison with native-born South Koreans. The day that the North Korean defector migrant population embraces the notion of being considered a multicultural part of the immigrant population of South Korea, I think will be a cold day in hell, to be honest with you.
Hi, my name is Paul Lee from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So I know you're not psychologists and you didn't, this was just a survey setting, so you didn't ask why respondents answered this way, but I'm curious about what you think the reasons are between these answers. So for the first question, the ethnocultural aspect, what do you think was the alternative? I mean, if they don't think ethnoculturalism is important to being Korean, then what would be important? And for the pride and the, what was the second one? Oh, closeness. Yeah. Do you think they answer that way because how they were treated by other South Koreans in South Korean society, or despite the treatment that they receive from, or discrimination or negative treatment that they receive from South Korean society?
The beauty of this project is you actually could ask why, to at least some of the people. That was why it was particularly useful to us, that instead of just having a survey where you do indeed just end up with a response that you can't dig into necessarily, if we were able to interview those people, which was the case with about 100 people, you could indeed ask why. And so there's enormous variation, I think it's fair to say, across the answers, but I know Stephen has a little bit more he wants to say about that.
Yeah. First, at the highest level of aggregation, just the mean scores, the averages. For the ethnocultural traits, most people think they're important still, in both North and South Korea. There is the older group thinks it's more important. So there's not a divergence. And there were a battery of national identity questions about what makes one truly South Korean. In addition to ancestry and tradition, you include following laws and political system, speaking the Korean language, and others that I'm blanking on. Anyway, they're there. That would get at an alternative. It doesn't ask as a follow-up, if you said no, what do you think is important, but it's a list of questions, a standard observational survey. And having looked at this inside and out, what you find is that there is a slight, among the South Korean population, younger folks, and the North Korean defector migrant, it decreases in importance, ethnocultural stuff. But it doesn't seem to be necessarily replaced by anything. A lot of folks like to say if ethnic nationalism is on the decline naturally, then the civic understanding or conception of a nation is rising from wherever. I don't think that's true. In fact, I really do not think it's true. You just have a decline in the importance of ethnicity as something which binds Koreans together. There's been a lot of books and new research on this, some of which I hope to contribute to, that show that younger South Koreans are much more interested in things such as class and status as the defining characteristics of Koreanness. And some of that trickles into the defector migrant responses. I will note for that item, that particular question, if you look at when we do our statistical analysis, that if you spent over the median number of years in South Korea, so you've been sufficiently exposed to the social and political institutions of South Korea, you will think that controlling for all these other effects, ethnocultural stuff, these traits are less important. Now, is that a function of the migrant experience of facing discrimination and saying, well, the hell with this stuff doesn't bind us together? Or is it an internalization of an emerging value in South Korea which states that ethnocultural traits are not important? Maybe a little bit of both, I think, but it's a tough question to answer.
I'm Ki-hee Kim from Cato Institute intern, and thanks for your insightful thoughts of the research. And my question is, the implications of this research is policy relevant, and what do you think about the legal status of these North Korean defectors? Because as far as I know, they have the duplicate legal status, meaning they have the same legal status as South Koreans, as well as they are given special status as well. So if this kind of legal status changes, then do you think there are the three variables like closeness, pride, and ethnocultural factors will incline more towards the South Korean national identity? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think you'd have to amend the Constitution for that to happen. I don't think there's any sort of support for that, not now anyway. There is definitely a growing sense of detachment, I would argue, some would not agree with me, that South Koreans feel to North Korea. I think right now is a bit of a tricky time to be saying that because we're in sort of a unique sort of period, I think, in North-South relations and U.S.-DPRK relations as well, apparently. And so if you were to take away their right to claim citizenship upon resettlement, then yes, I think it would definitely change the opinions. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, though.
But can you hit the button? That's an extreme version of responding to that question. I mean, if you're talking about removing some of the, you said duplicate status, right? Some of the benefits that accrue because you have a special status as a North Korean. I wonder whether the impact will be relative, like an in-group effect, given that there are significant differences in the degree of assistance provided to some groups of incoming North Korean defector migrants compared to others, in terms of between the mid-1990s and then the late 2000s and the late 2000s. I don't know. I think it would be a very interesting question to explore what impact such changes have had or would have on identity. But I don't have a concrete answer for you right now.
I'm Bob King. I've got some status at KEI. I'm not sure what it is, but was there any effort to look at the reasons people left North Korea and relate those to their sense of identity in terms of South Korea? Over time, I've met with a number of defectors, and they've had very different reasons for leaving the North. One woman that I met had a husband who left. Didn't have a particularly happy relationship, apparently, but she was well connected. Her parents were leaders in the party. They arranged for her to be driven to the border. They made arrangements for her to get across the border and be picked up, and she was whisked off and made a fairly quick trip. This is not the kind of thing that you usually get the impression that somebody has this ideological hatred for the North and therefore they've got to go to the South where they can enjoy freedom and that kind of thing. And there are a few of those who fit in that category. But yeah, it's not a big thing. Is there some relationship between why the individuals left and what their sense of identity is and how that relates to their perceptions?
We didn't search for it, but we could. We gathered data that would allow for that, but it wasn't a specific angle that we took towards this research. Stephen?
Anecdotally, yes. You can tell by it in the way in which, when we would speak with them, sort of just, having a free-flowing conversation outside of the structure of a survey, you would ask them stuff like, as a group, how do you identify? Or how do you, there are a lot of nouns that can be used to describe this group in South Korea, and it's a matter of political debate, and it can be interesting to see. I think one will indicate their sort of political identification by how they identify in South Korea, and some of them refer to themselves as Chayu something or another, so freedom people from the North. I'm blanking. In any case, what you'll find with those, and this is just purely anecdotally, we did not include it in part because we wanted to keep that kind of off the docket, for better or worse. But those who tend to leave because of a distaste for the North Korean regime and opposition to it are more likely to be, they're more likely to identify with the sense of the Republic of Korea, which has staked its existence in its opposition to the North Korean regime.
David Tully, State Department. I have a ton of statistical questions, which I'll ask you guys later. But the interesting thing to me is how the ethnocultural and pride questions were asked. It's asked specifically about South Korea, or at least it appears to be from the English translation. To what extent do you think that your respondents are responding as out-group members rather than in-group members? Even if they say they feel close to the ROK, that doesn't mean they feel they are part of the ROK. So to what extent are they rating as outsiders rather than rating as insiders?
The assumption of our research design is that they understand themselves as insiders, as given the right to citizenship by the Constitution of the Republic, and granted, a passport upon being resettled through the interview process upon landing in South Korea. There was another question there.
Yeah, to what extent are they responding as outsiders, even if they're constitutionally insiders? Do they feel themselves as rating from outside rather than inside?
Right. We assume that they are answering as an in-group member of South Korean society. Just the word, in case you're wondering, is Hanguk, that's used in the survey language in Korean, which is South Korea. We went back and forth on that a bit about that sort of language and these questions of in and out groupness, and we settled on the fact that we would assume, and that was an assumption of a research design. We did, and Chris can expand on this if he would like, also ask questions about their sense of membership and belonging in North Korea as North Koreans, but it was a separate part of the questionnaire. But that's also something quite different, which we didn't talk about here today.
Yeah, we ran some of the same batteries of questions, explicitly requesting that they answer with their views as North Koreans. There is absolutely, yes, the responses show, first of all, that they recognized that they were answering a question as a certain group, so they weren't, you could tell that there was focus on the questions being asked and the answers were deliberate. And there is difference between the responses in the different survey groups. Stephen, you have anything to add? No? Okay.
I must confess that I really do not like survey at all, So pretty much I try to use the survey experts if I needed it. When North Koreans settled in South Korea, what I discovered from majority of them is that they really have some kind of not of their own identity, but identity of the rock crisis. Most of them, either they flirting with the boss's wife, or you killed somebody, or you were hungry, or political asylum, whatever. They left the country and chose South Korea to be their next home, with some of the kind of romantic image of South Korea as a market economy, truly open society, everybody's equal, politics is a lot cleaner, democratic power change. But when they settled in South Korea, they found South Korea is very close to North Korea. Very severely class society. Even North Koreans from a different class background are treated differently in South Korea, given a better job, better stipend, better protection. And then also within the regime change, every regime change, North Koreans see what the hell is South Korea's policy in terms of unifying North Korea. So this is not a just question, but basically when you do this very beautiful vignette style study, what is your ultimate goal in terms of maybe writing 2 dissertations or just unification in action, try to get some proof? I would like to see some of the more in-depth kicking into those kind of things. But I really appreciated your good presentation.
I am healthily skeptical, I hope it's healthily skeptical of surveys as well. Which is why I like to fondly imagine that there's some symbiosis in this research team, right? That we are not both political scientists. Stephen has a great deal more capacity for data analysis than I have, but we have unique views of what constitutes a good research project. And I mean, this is an example of trying to go deeper than just doing a single survey. This was far more than that, and in the future, all of our research endeavors will hopefully probe these issues sufficiently deeply to get some genuine answers.
The first comment I want to underscore. I think you're correct, and it's not something I noted in introducing the research that was influenced by this new immigrant survey that's run by the World Values Survey in Canada. The difference there is most of those migrants are not coming from, they're not suffering from PTSD, right? And these migrants are, so that makes them completely different, a lot different, right? So that's noted, but we proceeded anyway, despite the flaws. And also, as Chris says, and it's the nice thing about collaboration, which I totally encourage young people thinking about going into research, that it's collaborating with someone who's not of the same sort of methodological predisposition as you tends to be a good thing. I think Chris has the penchant for deeper description. If you don't know Chris, he worked with the Daily NK, he's been with the defector migrant communities much longer than I have, and he has a much more he appreciates the nuance and the things which cannot be captured by a survey. Not because I'm a political scientist, but because I like data analysis and that sort of thing. I like surveys. And I think it does, when you try to objectively measure something, it does remove some of the subjective biases that inherently go into alternative research designs. But with any research design, there are trade-offs, definitely.
We'll take the question in the back and come back here.
I'm Grace Kong of the Institute for Korean American Studies. My question is, how do your findings mesh with the public polling results of this year in response to the summit diplomacy? Saw dramatic changes in public opinions, and I am wondering if your results had any predictive value or how you would integrate that with your findings.
I don't think it doesn't really speak to it a whole lot. Not our survey to the summit stuff doesn't, and the survey data that we work with from South Korea would be too old for that. So yeah, that's an underwhelming response, I know, but it's the accurate one.
The impact of changing politics in South Korea on the values and attitudes of young South Koreans and young defector migrants is a really interesting area of study. Are those changing values super sticky, or can they be altered through the political process? Right? Is all of the ongoing Moon Jae-in sort of summit diplomacy stuff having an impact on the values and attitudes of young people, either defector migrants or South Korean? We don't have answers to those questions, but hopefully in time answers will reveal themselves, and it will be very interesting to find out.
So, the esteemed scholar next to me, my neighbor, has a very interesting observation firsthand about those who have been traumatized in North Korea and then coming to South Korea. And not necessarily all migrant workers would have that, some would. And I guess not all defectors from North Korea necessarily had a traumatic experience. Right, okay. So I guess, I agree with you, Mr. Green, Chris, about maybe someday a study comparing those in-betweeners with their competitors from other countries. It's too bad. I guess that's either for you two or some others to do in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, you do one study and then another 25 studies present themselves, and before you know it, you've got to retire. So,
just to add to that, one thing that's really interesting, if you trace the development of these surveys, so the National Identity Survey implemented in South Korea started in about 2003, and it has proceeded by different organizations since then. Starting around 2010, they really started to add questions that are getting at the multicultural nature of South Korean society. So there are a lot of people who are becoming much more interested in this, which is reflective of the change in demographics of what is an increasingly pluralistic South Korean society. It's interesting.
This will be the last question.
Yeah, could you walk us through a little bit of the methodology of the interviewing? Because I know, Chris, you knew a lot of the defectors. You knew a lot of defectors beforehand. I don't know if it's the ones you interviewed, and if you use an interpreter or did the interviews in Korean, because you noted in the paper that it wasn't completely random, and the interviews were all conducted in the Seoul area as well. So, yeah.
There is endless amounts to say on this, and with your last question, you've introduced another 15 minutes of discussion. We actively sought not to include too many, or any, in fact, people who are really active in the North Korea human rights space. So the sample did not come from anyone directly related to Daily NK, for example. We did, however, speak with some people with whom I had worked and who would be classed as human rights activists about the nature of the survey, how we should ask some of the questions, things of that nature, just to verify that we were on something like the right track. So that's to be taken into account. What else to say? The interviews, there is a obvious effect from two large white foreign males. If we had conducted, I can't imagine that the results would have been the same if we had conducted all of these interviews. The interviews were conducted in Korean. We did attend many of them in order to verify that they were being conducted in a way that we had hoped that they would be, but they were conducted by a trained interviewer working who ordinarily works as a social worker in South Korea. So we were doing oversight, but we were not directly interviewing most of these people because that would have introduced the kind of effects that we did not want. Stephen?
Yeah, there were three methods so the surveys were online and paper. Online were possible because, goodness, it removes the data entry part of the job. But often that's not possible. As we learned, and anyone thinking about doing surveys of this group know that most of your stuff will need to be done on paper. The interviews, we did three different types. We did we did phone interviews, in person, and email. Of the in-person, some of those were focus groups / group interviews. Some of them were not so much of a focus group dynamic and more of just a group interview, but groups. Then one-on-one, phone interviews one-on-one, and email interviews. I will share a bit of insight from that. Don't do email interviews. The quality of the information is significantly lower because people have to type it out. But we wanted to cast a wide net because some folks, logistics are an issue. And so we gave the option. We kind of buried it in fine print near the bottom that you can request an email interview, and many did. And it did yield interesting information that was consistent with what we were hearing in the phone or in-person interviews. But the quality of the data, interview data from the in-person and phone interviews, is obviously much better.
So thank you all for your questions, and please join me in thanking our two speakers today for handling a great round of questions, as well as giving a great presentation. So please join me in thanking them.